connecting the dots. All of us at some time in our youth used to like to take puzzle books. And one of the puzzles in the puzzles books were a series of dots that you were to draw from line to line, from dot to dot, and eventually create a shape. And we know that it's all a matter of perspective. When we just see the dots, that's all they are. They're just dots. But once we start to connect those dots, then we get an entirely different picture. And it's like when you look at the stars at night, they're just dots in the heaven. But once you start to connect the dots, then you begin to see shapes, like Orion or Cassiopeia, or some one of those other shapes that the ancients used to see in the stars. And it's up to us to learn how to connect the dots in order to see the whole picture. And one of the ways we connect the dots in our own spiritual life is to go back to the very beginning when we hear God say, "Let there be light." And all of creation occurred. And our story begins. The first dot. And then as the creation began to develop and evolve, we get to the creation of man, our second dot. And that dot becomes very important because that becomes a moment when humankind interacted with its creator, the first dot. But that wasn't the only connection we have with our creator. As time went on, we meet Abram, who was chosen by God to become the father of his chosen people, dot 2. And out of that progeny of Abraham would become the chosen race, which will then go on for the next hundreds and hundreds of years and centuries, and the dots will continue to form. And we go through the Old Testament and we see dot after dot after dot, making a progression from one place to another in the divine intervention of God's story to us. We go on into the time when God sees that his people have fallen away from him, and he comes back to save them. And he brings us such people as Moses and Daniel and Elijah and Elijah, and they all come to bring us a message. They're all another dot in the connection of the biblical story of salvation. And as each dot progressively forms and lines are drawn between those dots, a story begins to evolve. And it's a story that's ours. It's the story of our salvation. And when we look at these dots, each as an individual experience, they may not seem connected to anything. It's only when we draw the line from one dot to the other that they begin to tell us the full story. And we can go through the Old Testament and go through adventure after adventure and development after development, from culture to culture, from kingdom to kingdom, to captivity to captivity, to freedom. And what we're seeing is a growth and development of faith. And what we're seeing is how God always comes down and rescues us. No matter how many times we fail, how many times we walk away from him, he always comes back. But if you're at the dot and you don't see the surrounding dots being connected, you lose your vision. And it's only when we see from the perspective, looking back at the dots in our history, that things begin to make total sense. And if you connect those dots from the beginning of the Bible to now, we can see that things happened in history that could only have happened if God had his hand in it. And he knows the final picture when all those dots are created and all those dots are connected. then we will know the whole story. And we're in a part of that story. We are a dot in that history. And in order for our dot to make sense, we have to look back at the dots that preceded us. And we have to make the connections between all of those dots to our dot today. And when we do, we will see a story that's incredible. A story that only God could have written. And it's a story that's written on our hearts. It's a story that develops in our relationship with the God who loves us. And when we get to the New Testament, those dots are further developed when we see Jesus comes. And he takes all of the Old Testament and he puts it into perspective. And he comes to do what he said he would do from the very beginning when we first failed. When Adam and Eve sinned, God said he would send us a Redeemer. And that Redeemer would come to save us. And many centuries and centuries later, that's what God fulfilled in that dot, in that moment in time, when he connected all the dots of the past and offered them all up on the cross on Good Friday. We have been redeemed. And the connections of those dots make Good Friday the reason why it happened. And since then, we are still connecting dots. We're connecting dots in our own history and the development of our life as Christians. And so therefore, we have to look at the dots that are before us so that we can make sense of the dot that we're in today. And it's up to us to see how all those things that have happened in the development of our church and the growth and development of our faith, that these things were all planned from the very beginning by God the Father who loves us. Connections. Are we going to let him connect the dots in our life? And are we going to see that we're all part of this divine plan? So, look at your life as a dot and a very, very important part in the entire picture. Because if your dot wasn't there, the picture wouldn't be complete. So, look at your life as part of a picture and look at how it's connected to all the other dots. So, learn to connect your dots.